What's going on, guys? Breakhaven here. So I've been getting a lot of requests on how I do my lighting setups, and I will do a video explaining how to get the perfect setup for your fragrance review videos in any video. But before we talk about lighting, it's very important that we know what our camera can do and the capabilities that we have. So we're going to do about a series of 3 or 4 videos explaining what ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are. This video is catered specifically for ISO, so let's just get into it. Now, if you don't have a DSLR camera, don't worry. I have a Galaxy Note 10 and I have a Pro mode on my Galaxy Note 10, so I'm able to adjust my ISO as well as my shutter speed. I am not able to adjust my aperture on my phone, just my ISO and my shutter speed, so you can't keep along if you do have a cell phone. I'm pretty sure iPhone users as well will be able to keep up. There may even be a specific app. If you don't have a Pro mode on your iPhone, I'm sure there's a specific app where you can adjust the settings of the internal camera. But let's get started. So what exactly is ISO? And I'm going to keep it very simple. ISO literally either brightens up a picture or darkens a picture. On the darker side of the spectrum, you're looking at, on the side of ISO 100. On the brighter end of the spectrum, you're looking at 6400 plus. So as a general rule of thumb, you usually want to keep your ISO as low as possible, because the lower you have your ISO, the more contrast you're going to have in your image and the more details you're going to have in your shadows. So that's going to be on the lower end. Now, when you're talking about cranking it up to ISO 3200 or 6400 and beyond, literally you're going to have some grain in the shadows. And if that's the look that you're going for, that's completely fine. Remember, guys, this is all art. There is no right or wrong. But generally speaking, you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. So let's talk about stops of light. So we measure light in stops. So from ISO 100 to ISO 200, that's one full stop of light. From ISO 200 to ISO 400 is one full stop of light. From ISO 400 to ISO 800 is one full stop of light. From ISO 800 to ISO 1600 is one full stop of light. From ISO 1600 to ISO 3200 is one full stop of light. And from ISO 3200 to ISO 6400 is one full stop of light. So are you able to see the trend? What's going on is the numbers are doubling. So from ISO 100 to ISO 200, it doubled. From 2 to 4, it doubled. From 4 to 8, it doubled. So that's one full stop of light. And it's important to, remember these numbers, and you will, because they're super simple. It's important to remember these numbers because whenever you start balancing light, and again, we're going to have a separate video about aperture and about shutter speed, but it's important to know these full stop of light numbers, because if you go up in one area, then you'll want to go down in another area, let's say shutter speed or aperture, to balance out the light. So it's important to know the stops of light. Now, more high-end cameras, it doesn't always go from 100 to 200. The more expensive cameras, there's intervals. So instead of going from 100 to 200, I may be able to go from 100 to 150 to 175 to 200. So I'm able to have increments with the more expensive camera, which may give me an even more accurate, balance of light. So that's pretty much what ISO is. It's either brightening up a picture, and remember, guys, whenever the picture brightens up with the ISO, it's gonna wash out your image and it's gonna put more or less detail in the shadows, and it's gonna be grainy in the shadows. It's gonna look really film-like, really grainy. But on the lower end of the spectrum, ISO 100, ISO 200, maybe ISO even 400, that's gonna preserve a lot of the detail in the shadows and, just have that great contrasty image. So as a rule of thumb, if I'm shooting outside, I'm shooting ISO 100 to 200. If I'm shooting inside in the daytime, there's window light, I'm probably shooting anywhere from 400 to 800. Now, when you're talking about ISO 1600, ISO 3200, and ISO 6400, okay, it's probably dark. So we're either shooting inside where it's dark, or we're shooting outside at night where it's dark, where you almost really don't have a choice but to crank up that ISO, which again is going to put more noise in the shadows. So I'm going to give you guys just an example of me cutting the ISO up on my camera just so you can see the differences in stops of light. So guys, look, it's my main man Gregory. So guys, we're currently shooting at ISO 100. So you're able to see, you know, and we're not balancing anything else. We're not balancing the shutter speed or the f-stop. We're just going to move up the ISO because this video is about the ISO. So as you see, we're at ISO 100 as of now. I want to go from ISO 100 to ISO 200. And as you can see, we're starting to brighten up the image, and this image probably looks, this is how the image probably should look. But we're going to crank up from ISO 200 to ISO 400 right now. This is currently ISO 400. As you can see, it's brightened up the image, and the image still looks pretty good. I can't complain. Again, I like to keep my, my images as dark as possible, but this looks pretty good. I can't complain. So we're gonna go from ISO 400 to ISO 800. Now, as you're starting to see the background or the contrast in the background, the shadows, they're starting to lift a little bit. So that nice moodiness that I had, it still looks pretty good. It doesn't look bad at all. But we're gonna go from 800 to ISO 1600. And now this is 1600. As you can see, the colors in the background are even brighter. We're losing some details. Maybe look down at the floor at anything that's black. It's probably getting a little bit brighter. So we're gonna go from 1600 to ISO 3200. Now, ISO 3200, we're really pushing it. So again, look at the blacks, look at the screen in the back, maybe even look at Gregory, the little black that's on him. So the shadows are lifting, and it's lifting the overall image. So if you look at the bear and also the chair that he's sitting on, the white is super blown out. That's way too bright. So when you talk about colors like white, you definitely have to consider that whenever you're balancing light. So again, the whites are super bright, and the highlights in the lights on the blinds are bright as well. So now we're gonna go from ISO 3200 to ISO 6400. Now the whites are completely blown out. The blacks are ashy. The color that was in the background is super washed out now. It's not as contrasted. It doesn't look as good. Now again, we're not balancing light, because typically if I was going to go high up in my ISO, I would go down on either my shutter speed, my aperture, or a combination of both, just to balance out the light. So that's why it's important to know the stops. So I'm just going to give you guys a quick quiz, and it's not really a quiz, it's just, just me talking. So I went from ISO 200 to ISO 6400. So let's count the amount of stops that is. Okay, so from ISO 200 to 400, no, actually, correction. We started from ISO 100 and we ended up at ISO 6400. So let's count the stops of light. So from ISO 100 to 200 is one stop. From ISO 2 to 4 is one stop. From 4 to 8, is one stop. From 8 to 1600 is one stop. From 1600 to 3200 is one stop. And from 3200 to 6400 is one stop. So guys, that is a total of 6 stops of light. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn up my f-stop, or also known as aperture. I go back and forth between saying aperture and f-stop, but they mean the exact same thing. So you see this number here, f2.8? I'm going to go up 6 stops just to balance out the light. So because we cranked up to ISO 6400, I'm going to crank the f-stop up 6 stops of light to darken it. So with ISO, when you go up in the number, it brightens it. But when it comes to f-stop, the higher the number, the darker the picture gets. And we'll talk about that in the next video, but this is like a preview into the next video. So think about it, from 2.8 to f4 is one full stop of light. From f4 to f5.6 is one full stop. From 5.6 to f8 is one full stop. From f8 to f11 is one full stop. And I think it's from f11 to f16 is one full stop of light. So as you can see, this image looks exactly how the image looked in the beginning. Unless I did a stop too early. So let me count. From f2.8 to f4, that's 1. From f4 to f5.6, that's 1. From f5.6 to f8, that's 1. From f8 to f11, that's 1. From f11 to f16, that's 1. So I need to go up again from f16, and I believe it's wrong one. I believe it's f22 is a full stop from f16. If I'm wrong, I'll put that in the description. But as you can see, ISO 6400 at f22 looks exactly the same as f2.8 at ISO 100. So we just balanced the light. And this is an introduction into our next tutorial. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys with the next video.
Ready, go.